You know, I'm going to give you a history lesson.
We got some dumbass motherfuckers floating around this country.
Start laughing! And when I do, start fucking.
Also, y'all did some nasty-ass jokes on my ass, too.
Funny jokes and unfunny jokes come out of the same birth.
You fucking guys are unbelievable.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why Are You Laughing? A History of Comedy podcast. And today, I am pleased to introduce to you George Carlin, the legend. It seems virtually impossible that we could get 200 episodes into this podcast without doing a biography episode about George Carlin. But by God, we've done it. I think it's a testament to us, really, that we've lasted this long without talking about one of the guys that it's almost hack to have him on your Mount Rushmore now. And that's part of the discussion I want to have today, where it's kind of just become tradition that when you say, who are the best comedians ever, you go, well, Pryor and Carlin, and then you have the rest of the conversation. But then what ultimately happens, and it has happened more with Carlin, much more than Pryor, it almost becomes cool at a certain point to be like, actually, I never thought Carlin was funny. You know, that's like the cool take to have, to be like, he was never great. So we're going to discuss today why George Carlin deserves to be considered one of the greatest ever, and we will debate that standing, if he deserves to be in that pantheon, and what his legacy really is for comedy, because he is definitely one of the true trailblazers for stand-up. Whether you liked his comedy or not, you cannot deny the influence and impact that he had on what comedy has become today. I mean, it's all over the place. If you look at any of your favorite comedians, there's drippings of Carlin in there somewhere, I'm sure. So I think it'll be a good discussion. And like I said, I'm surprised that it took us this long to get to a name like George Carlin, which means maybe we're out of ideas. Who knows? We'll see what the next 200 episodes look like. But I'm excited to get into it. And Craig is with me, the host of Very Good Chow, which is very exciting to have him. Go check that out at verygoodshow.org.
That's right.
And you can support this program at blindmike.net. You can find the links wherever you get podcasts there, Apple, Spotify, video now on Spotify as well. So check that out if you prefer that platform. But as always, video also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, comment. Helps more people find the show if you do that. So we appreciate you guys supporting the show that way. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, if you want early access and bonus content, the episode we released last week, as you're listening to this, was an episode we did a while ago about Howard Stern talking to a serial killer. It was a bonus episode we did like a year ago or something. So if you want that kind of early access to episodes that might get released one day or might not, then become a member on Patreon or YouTube. Like I said, all our links are there at blindmike.net. We appreciate you guys supporting the show. Thank you for doing that. And go back through the archives. Make sure there's none you've missed that interest you. All right, let's get into old George, shall we?
We shall.
Another one of these guys, and it seems inevitable when we talk about one of these old timers, that they lived a life. George Carlin was a guy who his father was a drunk. His mother basically had to escape from the home with her children, so he at a very young age, so he didn't really know his father at all. He was a goof off in school, so he ends up joining the military, which is where our story begins today, is him talking about his time in the Air Force.
Getting back to the Air Force, I didn't take to authority very well, but I was really bright when it came to this K-Systems mechanic stuff. I had the highest T-score in the history of the maintenance school at the time I got out, and they sent me down there to fix computers. There were analog computers, 3 of them in this plane, and there were 2 radar sets and optics. But I kept getting in trouble. I kept telling people the equivalent of that. You know what I mean? Yeah. Verbal equivalent of that. And they would say, stand over here. And I would say,
see, if you say a dirty word, we can get that out.
Yeah.
But if you do that, there's no way we can get that out.
You can't. No, see, there you did it again. So I had 3 court martials, and I had a slew of Article 15s. That's the punishment just short of a court martial.
That's right.
I never did any time. I had a court martial for failure to obey a lawful order. Another one was insubordination, and another one was falling asleep on guard duty during a unit simulated combat mission. It was cold. I went up onto the plane to sleep a while.
You were tired, exactly right.
I was tired.
Right.
And I'm the one who joined, so I ought to get to say what I do.
So how did you leave the Air Force?
It was mutual. It was like a divorce. It's like they looked at me one day and they said, you know something, this isn't working at all. You know it, we know it. If you leave now, we'll let you have the clothing. They let me have the clothes. Keep the little hat if you like the hat. Take the big long overcoat.
Shoes look good.
Yes, take them, but please go. Just go.
This is a smart guy.
I mean, just genuinely a genius on all fronts, and could have been so much more, it seems like, because the way he talks about it, kind of very, very matter of factly, is he could have had real impact for the Air Force. Like his test scores are high and all that, and he just didn't like it. He didn't take to it, which is kind of the mark of a real comedian. Like you're this guy in the fringes. You don't relate to the things you're forced to do, whether it's school or work or whatever. Like you just feel like an outsider, and that's what George was kind of his entire career. And by the way, we'll talk probably a lot about his, Lenny Bruce influence. And I remember we did the Lenny Bruce episode, and he got his way out of the military, I think by like dressing like a woman or pretending he was gay. I forget what the exact story was. Go back and check out that episode for.
I think he was cross-dressing. He got caught in a dress or something like that.
Yes, but purposely to get kicked out of the military, which is pretty brilliant.
I feel like that happened a few times. Didn't Chevy Chase do the same thing?
Chevy Chase, there's a lot of these guys that had military service of some kind, these comedians. They had the exact type of military service you would expect. Like George Carlin, the idea that he was falling asleep on the job is kind of perfect for what you would want to inevitably become a comedian. It'd be weird if we found, I think like Rickles was like a war hero, which is weird to think about,
And Rob Riggles too.
Yeah. So kind of an unexpected start for George Carlin, yet expected. Like I said, if you hear that George Carlin has military service, that's kind of what you would expect it to be. And this thing where it's like, you never quite fit in there, which makes a lot of sense given his later philosophies and beliefs. So let's keep going. George also claims that from a very young age knew exactly what he was going to be in show business to a degree, knew he wanted to be an entertainer. But like a lot of these guys that we talk about, and I say it ad nauseum on this podcast, that stand-up was not a legitimate art form back then in any way. It's really only the last maybe 20 or 30 years that people would get into entertainment and say, I want to be a stand-up. Like the era that grew up with Seinfeld. That's where I give Jerry a lot of credit. Like the era that grew up with shows like Seinfeld were the first to be like, oh, I can be a comedian. It wasn't this thing where it's like, well, I'll do stand up for 3 years and hopefully that'll get me an acting job and on and on and on. No, the only the last 30 or 40 years where it's really been in anyone's consideration for an actual career. Carlin was another one of those guys where he wanted to get into radio or acting or whatever it was, but he knew he wanted to be funny. He just wasn't necessarily sure how.
And next we have him talking about the boyhood dream.
Yeah, so this is exactly that, what he was thinking of when he was a kid.
Because I wanted to be like Danny Kaye. See, I saw Danny Kaye and Kid from Brooklyn and a couple of those movies, 47, 48, 49. I was 10, 11, and 12. And I thought I can do that. And so that, to me, that was actor. I didn't think of Ray Milland, Gregory Peck. I thought of guy in the movies, movie star, actor. I'll be an actor. Like that. I'll be a comic actor. I didn't know that distinction. Comic actor. I'm going to be an actor. And how am I going to do that? Well, I'm funny. I'll be a comedian first. If I'm funny enough, they'll have to let me be a funny actor. Because first you're a funny guy, and then they come, okay. So that comedian first. Now, how am I going to get to that? Well, I love these disc jockeys I listen to. I'm really good with my voice. My mother bought me a tape recorder in 8th grade, and I learned how to run it and how to project and do a lot of things on the tape recorder. It gave me confidence. And so I'm thinking, I can be a disc jockey first, and that's safe because you're kind of separated from the audience. They can't see you, and you have a little less risk. And then if I'm good enough at that, they'll have to let me be a comedian because I'll be a funny disc jockey. And then if I'm a good enough comedian, I'll be an actor. And so I had this path and this dream.
It's so funny hearing him say that, because I think that's probably true of a lot of radio guys, or even me, where like I like radio, podcasting, stand up, I like all of that, but like radio does feel safer. Now podcasting feels safer. It's like you're not up on a stage talking in front of people. So it's where you pointed out how smart he is in just every point that he makes. It's so insightful to look within yourself and be like, well, I was scared, so I got into radio. It's not this false, like, oh, well, I loved radio, even though he probably did as a kid. The other thing I want to point out there, Danny Kaye, all I know him from is people saying George Carlin wanted to be Danny Kaye. I assume if you Google Danny Kaye, George Carlin's name comes up, because that's the most pub he gets these days. I hear Danny Kaye's name every time I hear George Carlin mentioned. It's crazy how often he mentions him as a major influence. Like, that's who I wanted to be, was Danny Kaye. But I said, I forget what episode we were doing recently where maybe Ricky Gervais with Carl Pilkington.
Yes.
I'm surprised more guys don't start in radio, because for the reason George said, it does seem like a natural fit where you start on the radio, kind of build your chops as far as communication goes, and then get more comfortable on stage, or as George did, kind of, work out material in a lot of ways on stage. Like, there's material he does, we even have some of it, that he tried out on the radio, like the wacky hipster weatherman or the hippy dippy weatherman, shit like that. So like there was an ability to try that stuff out. Now, also talk radio wasn't what it became. So you didn't have this like long form way of working stuff out. So I do get that aspect of it. It was maybe more limiting than it became in later years. But I'm surprised there's not more comedic voices that started in radio. But George Carlin, much more straight-laced back then too. Didn't really know who he was as a performer. And I think his time in radio helped build that cynicism, because if I learned one thing in radio, as a guy that wanted to get into radio, I had a job in radio where I was the lowest level employee at the station, the scum of the earth, a street teamer. And even I, at that low level, saw you have the curtain peeled back pretty immediately to where like, oh, this is a miserable industry.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. For years, I would listen to guys on radio, sports talk radio, comedy radio, news radio, whatever you listen to, any personality will say, don't get into radio. It's a terrible business. And I would always go, oh, they are so cute.
What do they know?
Aren't they being hilarious when they say that? And it's unanimous. Like, it's just true. Everyone ends up hating radio at some point if you get into it. And I think that helped build some of George's cynicism.
Yeah, we have Radio Roots.
Yeah, so this is off of his first album, FMAM, that kind of shows you some of the disdain he ended up having for the radio business.
I was a disc jockey when I was 19. I was lucky. I found a job when I should have been still learning about it. And it inspired wonderful wino and Willie West, a character of mine. Radio stations, of course, changed personnel rather rapidly. Willie West is no longer at Wonderful Wino. He's been replaced by Scott Lame. Hi, gang. Scott Lame here. The boss jock with the boss sounds from the boss list of the boss 30 that my boss told me to play. Right here on the nifty 850. Wonderful Wino Radio. Wonderful Wino. The big sound in the big town. Wino time, bing bong. 5 minutes past the big hour of 5 o'clock. Hey, we'll get started. One of the big sounds this week. Number five. Last week was number 9. Number 9. Moved up 4 spaces. 4 spaces. Here it is, one of the new super groups, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young, Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Sacco, and Vanzetti. And the ever-present footprints cross the shadows on the carpets of the hallways of the memories of your mind.
And what's amazing about radio, and the reason that bit stood out to me, is because you hear George, a guy who was working in radio, was very young when he got in radio, a radio station near the military base he was stationed at. Is where he got his first job when he was like 18, 19 years old. And he ended up meeting his comedy partner, which we'll talk about in a minute. But like at a young age, he gets into radio, and very quickly, the mystique wears off, and you realize that it's a lot of the same horse shit. The creativity is even back then when it was much more independent, which is kind of amazing. But what stood out to me about George Carlin kind of talking about radio in that way is turn on a radio station now in 2026, and technology is different and the music is different, but like it's more or less exactly that. It's the same tired horse shit. They're doing the same bits they were doing 20, 30 years ago. It's crazy. It's crazy how radio has said, world, keep on moving. We're going to stay right here. We're going to be exactly where we were 100 years ago. It is crazy. And like I said, that mystique wears off. But Carlin was a guy like making fun of it there. You didn't really have people poking fun at that format until 20 years later, 30, Howard Stern and O&A, like more people would do it as talk radio emerged. But you didn't have a lot of guys questioning. It was just that's what was on in your car, and you didn't really give a shit. It was just a distraction while you were on the road, I guess, that you never really thought about. But
I do want to know who was the first person to talk like that on the radio, and who was the first program director that was like, "You've got it."
That's the voice. That's the voice we'll use forever now.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the type of mind George Carlin has, where this thing that we're all kind of programmed to not even really think about. Why would you question it? Because it's just always been there. George is like, hey, this is kind of bullshit. No. And that's the type of minds that were necessary to usher in what we now know as stand-up comedy. Lenny Bruce and Carlin and Pryor and Mort Saul and all these guys that were doing something other than Take My Wife Please and that type of shit.
Yeah. Next we have the rise of stand-up.
Yeah, so this is exactly what I'm talking about, where like these voices were necessary, and it was a very different thing. And George realized how he could help kind of move the goalpost a little bit.
Don't forget what had just come before Burns and Carlin, before 1960 in comedy. The individual comedians who wrote their own material and projected individual personalities had emerged. Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, Shelley Berman, Nichols and May, Bob Newhart, Dick Gregory, Jonathan Winters. These comedians in the late 50s and early 60s had reshaped comedy, given it a new feeling, a new touch. And this was the beginning of what Tony Hendra calls boomer humor, which was the sicko, irreverent, holding things up to ridicule and attacking them, as opposed to the kids today and crabgrass and my wife shops too much. As opposed to that, nothing sort of comedy. This was comedy about values, the world, and in a lot of cases, self. We did things about the freedom rides, integration. These are now much dated terms, but they were very on the edge then, integration, and the KKK and the John Birch Society. So we tried to express our own sense of irreverence and
what's interesting too, hearing him talk, is I'm kind of realizing like there aren't a lot of guys now, if any, that are doing what Carlin and Lenny Bruce did 60 years ago, or even more. Where like I just bashed radio for not changing, but I think this generation of comedians has kind of rested on their laurels, and they're like, well, I'll do what Carlin did. Or I hear Gary Goldman say, like Gary Goldman, who I think is a very funny, underrated comedian, but I've heard him say this about himself, where he's like, am I really doing anything that Jerry Seinfeld didn't already master? Talking about like observational comedy. And I personally think Gary Goldman's funnier than Jerry Seinfeld, but there's something to be said for that, where it's like, are these comedians just finding new tweaks to what prior generations did, or is there anything new? And it's why I love Bo Burnham so much and mention him so frequently on this show, is because on the surface, you wouldn't think of Bo Burnham necessarily as a direct descendant of Carlin. But if you listen to anything he says or anything he attempts to do, he's very Carlin, Lenny Bruce. Like he's trying to do something different. He has a different way of thinking than anyone else, which, granted, it is hard to ask people, hey, think in a completely new way that anyone else has ever done and be successful at it. That's very difficult. But there aren't a lot of guys in this generation that I think are doing that. Leave in the comments who you think I'm missing, because name some that are doing something entirely different that we haven't seen before. Because I don't know that it's a lot of guys. I think people just say, "Hey, I'll be the next Carlin, the next Pryor, the next Chris Rock." There are very few guys that are like, "I'll be the first of a kind."
Maybe Colin Quinn.
Yeah, but I mean, Colin Quinn, and I love Colin Quinn, and I think he's tremendously underrated. There's a lot of Carlin influence there, and he comes from that cloth for sure. Like I mentioned Bo Burnham because like there's no one that's really ever done what he has done.
Definitely, and I think Bo Burnham kind of re-kicked off the musical comedy for a while. People were like, "Oh, that's working. Let's do that."
Yeah, but again, no one can do what he did. A lot like Norm, where like. There are ripoffs of Norm and people who do his voice, his cadence, whatever, but there's no one else that thinks like Norm.
Right.
And by the way, that's impossible. I'm not shitting on comedians that aren't able to do that. You either have that gear or you don't. It's not something you can make up,
Right. Next we have comedy duo.
Yeah, so he mentioned Burns and Carlin in there, so we will hear more about who they are.
On the Merv Griffin show, or the Tonight Show, and Jack Parr was off, as I recall. Arlene Francis.
Yes.
And you had a partner then.
That was Burns and I. Jack Burns, George Carlin, Burns and Carlin. He later was much better known for being part of Burns and Schreiber.
Oh, sure.
They were a little more famous. Jack and I did we did one television show, the Jack Parr Show, and Arlene Francis was the host that night. Artie Shaw and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. were on. The nice thing about doing that show, do I have a minute to develop this?
Sure.
Jack and I we wanted to be comedians. We wanted to get into show business as a comedy duo when we met in Boston at that radio station. Lost track of each other, and he showed up when I was working in Fort Worth. And there was a news opening. He was a good newsman. He got the news opening, and he was my nighttime newsman. My earlier nighttime newsman was Bob Schieffer, who's now the CBS.
Oh, really? At CBS?
Yeah, I had a lot of famous newsmen. So Jack Burns and I developed these routines at home, and we would go to this club called The Cellar, which was the place that the Kennedy Secret Service people got bombed the night before.
Not the Comedy Cellar, for anyone wondering.
Yeah, I hope they knew that.
Yeah. I figured. I just wanted to clarify.
Drinking.
You must have heard all about that in your nighttime JFK gets shot streams.
They mentioned it they said this is not the New York Comedy Cellar, folks. Let's think.
Salty dogs all night. That was the club. We used to go there. It was like a coffee house, and we would do these routines and dream about being in show business. We're still in radio. Mm-hmm. Then we would retire to our apartment and we'd watch Jack Parr. That was the holy grail for young comedians.
Oh, sure.
Watch Parr, and then we'd fantasize. We'd do make-believe interviews with each other as if we were on the Parr show, and they were filthy. They were just for fun. Yeah. They were filthy. We'd sit there on our underwear, drinking beer. Now this is February 1960, still in radio. And do these funny little dreams about being on the Tonight Show someday. October of that year, we were on it. What is that? About 7 months, not much more than 7 months later, we were on that show. So I always tell people, your dream can come true. You just never know how fast or how soon. We were on a fast track for some reason. We got out of that station, went to Hollywood, got into radio here in K-Day, got out of that into nightclubs, and boom, we did the Tonight Show and had an album out all within.
I had never heard that it happened that rapidly for Carlin. And I don't even know if a lot of people know that he was a part of a comedy duo. And Jack Burns is a guy that got much more into improv than Carlin. So they just kind of naturally drifted away, at least professionally. And makes a lot of sense. I can't imagine Carlin doing what he did as part of a comedy team, I can't imagine him ranting about politicians and then looking over at Jack for his thoughts. It doesn't really work. So the interesting thing about the industry...
You don't think 7 dirty words would be more interesting with someone going, you really shouldn't say that.
You know what? Now that you're pitching it that way, I kind of like it. But there's a hole in the 7 dirty words.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about that trajectory is like, I think we hear it a lot now how it's much easier to make it and things are oversaturated, which there's a lot of truth to. You know, you can go viral on TikTok or whatever, but it is harder to find that audience because everything is so vast and expansive. You know what I mean? Like you might post something on TikTok and it goes fucking crazy, or maybe literally no one sees it. There's a legitimate chance of that. Whereas, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, there's 3 channels. So either you make it or you don't. You know, if you're on CBS for that 5 minutes or NBC or whatever, you're the only people on the air at that time. So there's this feeling of, holy shit, I've made it. You know, it's not this thing where it's like you see one video and then you forget. Now you are kind of fast tracked. So George Carlin at this time doesn't really know what he is, but he's this guy who very quickly got success. And now you do all the things that you're supposed to do. You do Merv Griffin and Ed Sullivan and Carson and all these shows because that's what you're supposed to do if you're in comedy. That's just what the layout is. There haven't been many guys who have done it before. So you just kind of follow that path. And then at a certain point, George Carlin realizes, like, wait, I don't know if I fit any of this. I don't know if it makes any sense. Like, he's wearing a suit and like a straight-laced guy, and his type of humor is a little more generic, or not, certainly not as personal or the social commentary that he ended up doing. So he started to have to examine, like, who am I as a comedian? Should I be doing all these things?
And next we have Mainstream Breakthrough.
Yeah, so this is him, like I said, going through all the steps that you're supposed to, and let's hear about it.
In order for me to follow this kind of mainstream dream, I had to play their game. I didn't call it that then. I didn't know these things then. This is how it was happening, and I define it in retrospect. But I had to kind of follow their blueprint, which was, you went, I mean, where else are you going to go? You're going to go to television. You're going to get on variety shows. I did things like the Perry Como specials. I did the Jimmy Rogers show. Hey, the way I broke through nationally was in 1966, the summer of 66, I was on a show called Kraft Summer Music Hall with John Davidson. We wore white pants all the time. Guys had striped vests and straw hats and things. I had to sing Winchester Cathedral. This was all very vanilla American. I didn't know how uncomfortable that was making me. I just knew how uncomfortable I was. And finally, that all had to change. And what happened was the culture changed around me, began to really be significant. The anti-war movement, the introduction of acid and mescaline and so forth. And I myself did some acid and some mescaline, which I think hastened my change, gave me the ability to feel these things and put them into motion. And that's what happened in the late 60s. I abandoned this other dream of mainstream path to Danny Kaye and thought, I'll be myself. I'll start talking about what's in my heart.
I told you he loves Danny Kaye.
He really does.
It's so interesting, too, the similarity between Pryor and Carlin, these guys that are kind of linked together in their legacy, where they both started out these straight-laced, not pretending to be something they're not is not even the right term. It's just doing what you're supposed to do. You know what I mean? You put on a suit and you go on the Tonight Show and you tell clean jokes. Like, that's what comedians did at that time. And thank God, future generations should say thank God for guys like Carlin and Pryor that said, well, what if we didn't do that? You know, like, what if we spoke to people that are more like us, that are weirdos and whatever? And if you look at someone like Carlin, I think someone like that now, you have people like Jeff Dye is a great example. People accuse Jeff Dye of this, where now from 2016 on, you kind of had this anti-woke movement in comedy where people started getting canceled and other people were fighting against that. And now this new wave of people started seeing, oh, wait a minute, Joe Rogan got really successful fighting cancel culture. Shane Gillis got really famous after getting canceled. Maybe I should make this my thing. There started to be currency because then the pushback becomes so that, Greg Gutfeld is *1 in late night. And you have all these things happening where maybe I'll get on there one day. but like you have these things happening where now it becomes cool to be against the woke movement or against cancel culture and that stuff. So it starts to shift the other way, and people like Jeff Dye, or at least this is what people accuse Jeff Dye of, say, well, let me get in on this. Might not necessarily believe everything I say, but let me craft a certain stance.
So it's crazy because I think it's because, like social media and everything that you see it more. But back in 2004, they were talking about the pendulum on Tough Crowd,
right?
And they're like, oh, I don't know if it's going to swing back. It always does.
If you go back and listen to Tough Crowd, it's so interesting how much the discussions, instead of back then they're talking about Iraq, it's so drastically different. They're talking about Iraq instead of Iran. But so the conversations are like technically different in headline, but they are so relevant today. Like you can apply them to so many stories today. It is you are right in that it switches like that. So like, I think the difference for Carlin back then is that it is not an opportunist movement to say, oh, let me go with these weirdos and the hippies and the protesters. That wasn't cool back then because that's not what got you on the 3 channels that there were. That's the main difference is now you can carve out a niche because of the internet and podcasting and all of that, social media. You can find these people that agree with you or like what you're doing or like what they think you represent. Back in the 60s and 70s, that was very difficult. So it was a real ballsy move of Carlin to say, you know what, this is more who I am. And I don't give a shit if people think I'm a druggie or it costs me, they think I'm weird or whatever, because I am weird. Like, I think that fits me more. So it's a ballsy move back then to be I'm going to take this risk.
I am weird. Cocaine is sick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, kind of speaking of, the next clip is with Johnny Carson talking about his arrests.
Yeah. So the other thing I was going to mention is he talks about drugs. What's interesting about Carlin is like he is an old hippie, but he talks about drugs in a very measured way. So again, that intelligence that he has, where he says, I forget the exact quote. I think we have it later, but he talks about acid and weed. And I'm trying to think of the exact phrase, but he basically says like it changes you in a way that is positive. Like it opens you up and makes you see more. And he says that's not necessarily a good thing all the time. Like that can take over you and it can take you to a place. So like he views it in a good now because now you hear people talk about mushrooms or ayahuasca or these things, and a lot of the people that have a good experience on it, it's like everyone needs to do it.
Right.
Carlin was a little more realistic in that, like, it was good for me. It's not good for everyone. And it's not good all the time. Like he understood there were limits to it.
Well, if you think about it, it's like the wrong person's brain doing whatever it wants. Is
right. You could get George Carlin, you could get Charles Manson,
Correct.
Yeah.
But here he is talking about his arrest with Johnny Carson.
Yeah. So this is this clip like is so important for what comedy became when you think of what they are discussing. It's crazy that this happened in this country, a generation ago. Like our parents were alive while this happened.
But anyway, thank you for that.
Now, George, you must promise me something. You won't get me in any trouble on the show tonight because I've been reading about your problems in Milwaukee and they busted you there or tried to bust you or there's a court case pending.
Right.
Because, and I don't want to jeopardize the case, so I have to be careful the words I use, I guess.
Right.
You allegedly, let me put it that way, used some words in your act which brought about a bust, saying that you were, what was the technical language in the...
Oh, it was disorderly conduct - profanity, as opposed, I guess, to disorderly conduct drunk, disorderly conduct something else. The state didn't want to have anything to do with it. They didn't want to prosecute it because you're covered by the First Amendment in freedom of speech. The city did, however, follow. There was one policeman at this summer fest. There were about anywhere from 35 to 55,000 people present. It's a piece of material, quote unquote, that I've done everywhere.
It's so crazy. You would think like that exists from a different, I mean, it is a different century technically, but you know what I mean? You'd think it's hundreds of years ago, but like
you would think that's England today, right, Mike?
Exactly. You're damn right, brother. But there's people listening to this podcast that were probably alive when that happened. Like that's crazy to me. that was the world. And, we've talked about before where Norman Lear fighting to get the word pregnant on the air. But it's interesting how we advance and whatever the opposite is. What's the opposite of advance? Retreat in so many ways.
Regress.
Regret. Thank you. We regress in so many ways and advance where there's so much stuff we can't say now. But the idea that you can't say fuck in public, it's crazy. Like kids, you hear kids yell it in public now.
I know.
So it is really crazy. And you can argue whether that's ultimately good or bad for comedy. I do think there's something to Seinfeld's argument where some of those boundaries that you have on language almost make it funnier because you have to put more work in to get to the joke. I think there's something to be said for that. I also think sometimes the word fuck, when used properly, is just better than whatever you were going to substitute it with.
Right.
So I do think ultimately what George Carlin did for language is so pivotal in the history of comedy and just the groundwork for what came after him. And he's a guy, I mentioned this a lot on the show, the idea of how important language is, and where there are certain guys that I love just the language and the vocabulary that they use. George Carlin's the godfather of that. Wherever he's a poet. Like a lot of his comedy specials, especially at the end, were just him doing artistic things with words, not even necessarily jokes. Like, listen to what he did with slurs. He just lists slurs, and somehow you're like, that's beautiful. The way he was able to mesh all that together.
Yeah, parents hugging their kids, being like, "You guys paying attention to this?
This is an artist." Yeah.
Next is 7 dirty words.
Yeah, so I mean, this is like we've talked about this before, like when we did Chris Rock, Bring the Pain, where Chris Rock has a couple of there's very few jokes in the history of comedy where you can just name the joke and everyone knows what you're talking about, like the way you can with like black people versus N-words. 7 dirty words is like the bit where it's like that's your go-to. Dice's nursery rhymes, 2 or 3 Chris Rock jokes, and 7 dirty words.
Hot Pockets.
Well, sure, I guess.
We can't forget the machine.
I'm forgetting the machine. It's a different category. But 7 dirty words is like the ultimate joke that people reference when you think of go-to stand-up comedy bits. I think for a lot of reasons. I mean, it was very funny. It was innovative but it was touching on something that I think was so important to the culture at this time, the ability to express yourself exactly the way you wanted to. And Carlin presented it in such a brilliant way. So this is the bit that he got arrested for that he was just talking about on Carson.
In looking for these words, I kept finding new categories. We have so many ways of describing these dirty words. We have more ways to describe dirty words than we actually have dirty words. That seems a little strange to me. It seems to indicate that somebody was awfully interested in these words. They kept referring to them. They called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse, in poor taste, unseemly, street talk, gutter talk, locker room language, barracks talk, bawdy, naughty, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of was shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits.
The joy in that room when he says it's so different than now, like and we talked about Kill Tony a couple weeks ago, where sometimes I think it's overblown how often this happens on this show. Like if you listen to Maron, I don't think it happens to the degree that he wants you to believe it does. But there is an element on that show where it's like, just go on there, make a trans joke, people will clap, There's a hint of that on that show because it feels like something you're not supposed to say. These are things like you couldn't say in polite society under threat of possibly getting arrested. And I understand not in your homes or anything like that, but like you couldn't hear an artist say that. It was legitimately dangerous for a guy to get up on stage and say the shit that Carlin was saying. So that cheer is more than like, ooh, he's saying a naughty thing. It's like, holy shit, this guy's got a set of balls on him, you know?
Which is funny because like a bit like that now would get like a
Yeah. Well, although there is, as I mentioned, Carlin's influence, I think that reminds me a lot of what Louis started doing with I mean, I think the influence from Carlin to Louis is pretty clear, but like what Louis started doing with language, with the F word and the N word and the C word, like that is all that stems from what Carlin kind of picked apart with this first layer of curse words, you know?
Right.
Next, and it is also brilliant, by the way, and this is very Louis also. But just to such a matter-of-fact observation that seems right there that like, no one else would really think of at the time, where it's like we have so many more ways to describe dirty words than we actually have dirty words. Such a brilliant springboard for that bit, you know?
Right. But next we have him talking about the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so this another case. It wasn't just arrests that Carlin faced. Another case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and while it didn't necessarily involve George Carlin, in many ways it did. Carlin was not facing any legal trouble here, but it did involve a bit of his that was played on the radio.
Radio station in New York played it. A listener-supported station, therefore no commercials. WBAI played that entire cut in the afternoon on a show called Lunch Pail. And they warned the audience. They said, this show today is about language taboos and some of the inconsistencies and so forth. And we're going to play something for you. If you're not ready for that sort of thing, don't like that, think you won't like it, please don't listen.
To be clear, I kind of made it sound like it was a different bit. It is the 7 Dirty Words. If I confused you at all, it is the same 7 Dirty Words bit.
A professional moralist was driving around with his teenage son in the car. Someone from
Is he making a joke or was that an actual position back then?
So when I looked it up, he's referred to as that more than one. It wasn't like, I don't know if George is calling him that with derision, but I've seen it written up as that, a professional moralist. I don't know who gives him that title, but I have seen it other places. I think it was Greg Murchison.
Yeah, it doesn't appear that would be like a crazy position to actually have.
It would be wild, but it would also be something in 1973 that I wouldn't be shocked if it existed, you know?
All these libs are like, I could got paid for this.
Yeah, right. Well, they are, but
that's a great point.
I think it was called Morals in Media. If not, it was something very much like that. He heard it, listened to the whole thing. Apparently, he and the son were not morally affected by it. And in a market in New York with car radios included that probably numbered 25 or 30 million radios, this was the only complaint the FCC received. And for whatever their reasons were, they just sanctioned the station, $100 fine and a little mark against your record when you come up for renewal. The station refused the sanctioning and decided to fight the FCC. That's really what happened. And they won their case in district court. It went to whatever levels first and then to district court, which is the Court of Appeals in D.C. It's a 3-judge court, and they won that case. The radio station won 2-1. So the FCC was overturned. The FCC went to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1973 with this case, and it took 5 years to go through the mill. In 1978, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 that the FCC had the right to regulate what they termed indecent language. It wasn't obscene because it didn't meet those tests, but it was a new category of filth. I was sort of proud they had carved out a new category of filth for me, initially for me, called indecent language. You know, the perverse person in me loves the fact that I'm a part of, I'm a footnote in American legal history, the only case in the Supreme Court ever based on a comedian's routine. And that they had to read these words out loud in court. I'm just proud of that.
And which is legitimately something to be proud of. Like, as a comedian, what higher honor is there than that? You know, George's Law, essentially.
That's pretty good.
It is pretty great. And by the way, credit to that radio station for not just paying the fine and being like, no, fuck you.
Right.
We played it. That would never happen now, by the way.
No. Like, we're so sorry. Please don't.
Time balls in radio would bend over immediately. But yeah, good on that radio station, and good on George Carlin for having that distinction, because I think a lot of the things that comedians fight for now are a little like they're mild. You know what I mean? Like, I think legitimately there was a time, and I'm talking not that long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was, maybe even less, where like saying the word retard on stage, it's mocked now. That was a brave thing in a weird way, because they're saying, like, I don't really give a fuck if you come after me. I'm going to talk the way I talk, the way that I think it needs to be said in this joke. Now, if you're still doing it just for shock value or to be naughty, then it's kind of lame. But I do think there was a stretch where saying some of these words you weren't supposed to say was an important thing, because it was a fuck you to the people who were trying to take that away for reasons that were ridiculous, frankly. You know what I mean? Like, they were grandstanding and all sorts of things. And I plan on doing an episode about that soon, hopefully, about that kind of era in comedy. But my point being, like, I don't know if there's a lot of that, the balls that it took to be George Carlin the way it is now, because I think you're able to carve out an audience on the other side. While there are people trying to attack you from one direction, you'll find sanction with the other people. Like, it's half the country. So half of them are going to be like, well, come over here and be one of us and you can make some money.
Next, we have him talking about his favorite thing, drugs.
Yeah, so this is a little more. I was talking about that earlier, but this is a little more of the drugs that helped him progress his career in many ways and become the George Carlin that we know, but also in some ways hurt his career.
To things like cocaine or any of the other ones we all know, and you get to the addictive drugs, it's a different story. And that's what happened in the early 70s once I had started my record career.
One of the fallout things that happened as a result was Carson. He sort of distanced himself from you when you're going through this change.
Well, when I went through these changes, my appearance, my hair got longer, my beard grew, and my clothing became closer to I guess you'd call it the hippie ideal, And now some people in show business, some old, the old timer, not old timers, but the old school people, they thought that I was making a very crass decision to, as I heard it from one guy, to cash in on the hippie thing. That was their way of looking at this from the outside. They weren't attuned to the kind of, pot is a value changing drug. It's a hallucinogen. It's a mild hallucinogen like acid, and it's a value changer. And if you smoke from the time you're 13 till the time you're 30, you have formed certain attitudes, and it just reinforced my malcontent, my outsidership, the feeling of being outside and not belonging. So these people had never had that, so they couldn't see that there might be some integrity in what was happening to me, and they thought, well, he's just trying to cash in. Don't worry about it. They'll see you through him, and
he thought you were doing a Bobby Darin. With
just going to the mountain and coming back. I am different, and it wasn't that. It took 2 years for this change to take place physically with the growth of the beard and the hair, and I did it on television. There were syndicated shows I was doing by that time. Virginia Graham had a 5-day-a-week show. Della Reese had a 5-day, and so did Steve Allen. And on these shows in this change period, I would explain what it was, that I don't belong in nightclubs. I belong on the colleges. I belong on the campuses. The beard would get longer. The hair would get longer. And by the time 2 years was up, I was there. But in the meantime, regular show business, which I cared very, little about, but Johnny Carson was important. That was another platform that I wanted to show my kind of like new self. And they got afraid when they heard about it, because they thought, oh, he's on the acid. He's on the acid.
Yeah, which is, it's interesting to think, because I think like the idea of hippie LSD or acid users at that time, whatever. Like, it's such a staple of how we think of the 70s. So you don't really think of a time back then where people were like, is he all right? but I guess it's like any time where, like, if you go from this guy who's kind of straight-laced, wearing a suit on stage, to all of a sudden wearing a tie-dye and sandals, and you're growing your hair out and you're all fucked up, it is natural for people to think like, oh, this guy is losing it. Like, they don't look at it as this existential thing. I will say that I was a little surprised to hear Carson just kind of gave him this sort of soft ban for a time. It was a number of years that he was not on the Tonight Show. He ultimately ended up coming back and guest hosted a bunch, and he was welcomed back with open arms to the Tonight Show. But Johnny, as far as guys of that era go, he's definitely straight-laced, but he doesn't seem like as much of a stiff as I would have thought to be like, oh, he's on drugs. We got to get him off the show. You know what I mean? Like, that did surprise me a little from the limited amount I know about Carson.
He's on the acid.
He's on the acid. Yeah.
But here they are talking about the Tonight Show.
This was just a good Tonight Show story, I thought. So he talks about, he gets back on and guest host, and I thought this was a fun story from his time at the Tonight Show.
Johnny obviously knows talent because you ended up coming back and hosting. You filled in as guest host how many times?
I don't know. It must have been 20 times I guest host. I've done 140 of those shows, counting Jay Leno, starting with Jack Parr.
Did you enjoy co-hosting, or was that too straight for you?
No, it was. I enjoyed the status that it gave me, and the exposure to talk about whatever other things I wanted to talk about. But it wasn't coming. And I was loaded on coke on a lot of those shows that I co-hosted. I did one show when I was loaded, and David Carradine was one of the guests. All right. I believe he was on acid that night. I only just say I believe that. I've never asked him. He came out in one of these, he was in that kind of Far Eastern, that period.
Kung Fu thing.
Yeah, well, this was more like Far Eastern. It was kind of a diaphanous, sort of a flowing white garment, and he came out and he was sitting there on the couch with his legs in the crossed position up on the couch. And I could swear to this day that each time I asked him a question, that he was answering the next one. That's how fucked up I was.
I just love that story. There's no other reason to play it. It does feel like a scene in the show, Louis, where it's like if Louis took acid, like the guest would be answering the next question. It's such a hilarious idea. But it's I like that George kind of liked using some of these mainstream platform. Like, he didn't fight against them, which I think stereotypically you would think that of a guy like George Carlin, where he'd constantly be like, fuck the man. But he looked at it as, I'll get on the Tonight Show and I'll promote myself to everyone. And then of that massive group, the people who get it and get me will come to my shows and buy my records. Like, he understood that. And he was, he played the game for the Tonight Show and he wouldn't curse on there. And then if you go to his live show, he would unapologetically be himself. And I think a lot can be learned from that. I think we've lost something in society now because, like, George Carlin became, he's known for the 7 dirty words and getting arrested, and he's this hippie drug addict. And then he was Mr. Conductor on Thomas the Tank Engine. and we allowed that. And we've done episodes about Gilbert Gottfried and Bob Saget, who are these dirty comedians, and we're also involved in kids shows and movies and stuff. Like, you would allow people to fit in more than one box. And I think we've lost that now, where it's like, oh, okay, Nate Bargatze's a clean comedian. We'll let him do a game show on ABC, and he has to do a PG-rated movie, and he has to fit in these boxes. Whereas if you're dirty, you have to be, you're R-rated. You have to be censored, and you have to be put in this category, and you can be the naughty guy. We don't allow people to be more than one thing anymore. And I think it was a lot cooler and more fun when we did accept that a little bit. and say, hey, if you like this guy, check out more of his stuff, and maybe you won't be able to tolerate all of it. Carlin had a story where he said his mother was always against his act. She would tell him, like, you don't have to curse as much, and she was against the dirty language and everything, until someone at her church said, no, the interesting thing about what your son is doing is he's using those words to kind of show the context to them, and he's layering it. It's not just this filth for the sake of filth. And he said, and that's when my mom was like, oh, I like that you do that, just because the church said it was all right.
You know what? It was pretty good.
Yeah.
I like the idea of a coked out train conductor, though, just telling everyone to go. They start crashing, and like the kids are crying.
I believe replaced Ringo Starr on that show, if I'm not mistaken.
What a wild lineup that show had.
And then Alec Baldwin, I think, if I have that correctly.
That sounds right, actually.
Yeah. I'm not sure if they all played the same character or not, but
coked out Alec Baldwin shooting trains. Next we have him talking about debt.
So I didn't know this, that the reason he could not take a lot of acting roles was having to get out of this tremendous debt that he had. Well, let's hear him talk about it before I get more into it.
Tell you something. You want to know something? In 1980, my career was in the crapper. I was on what I thought of as a plateau.
Right.
And I was $3 million in debt to the IRS.
Wow.
All right. And at that time,
how does that happen? $3 million.
Because I was full of cocaine for about 5 years, and I didn't pay any attention to the people that were running my affairs at that time.
And what did they do? They took
rolled
money
it
from
over.
you?
Every time I would, no, they didn't steal from me. They made bad decisions. They allowed me to make bad decisions. I didn't monitor them, and they kept rolling over my debt, and penalties and interest started to build up.
But they pay your taxes, but then you'd have debt because you would get into bad tax shelters.
They had a thing called rolling them over and being able to put them off a year and so forth, and accept the penalty. I don't know how that worked.
And you were going through all your money because you were on drugs,
and because I was buying and doing a lot of things that were stupid.
Right.
You know, like having like more. My daughter wanted a horse to ride, so we had like 6 horses.
Right. Went overboard.
Stupid. Right. What happened was this: in order to pay off $3 million, you had to earn 6 because you had to pay 3 on the 6 to get the 6, and then 3 on the. And you still didn't buy a hat.
It's very hard to get out of debt like that.
I never would have imagined George Carlin as a guy like, oh, my daughter wants a horse, let's buy 6 horses. I was not picturing
cocaine's a hell of a drug, as we've heard.
It sure is, yeah. I was not picturing that at all. But yeah, that's what drugs can do to you, and bad management and all sorts of stuff. But what's interesting about that is he said what forced him to write more and be on the road more was he had to make money. So he had to go do stand-up, which was guaranteed money, rather than taking less to act, which maybe it would lead somewhere, maybe it wouldn't, because George Carlin wasn't getting starring roles ever. And again, this wasn't a time like Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, Steve Martin, these are rare cases back then. It wasn't just like, oh, you're a successful comedian, let's put you in a few movies, let's put you in a TV show. I mean, like, you know, Newhart had that, but like Rickles didn't. Like it wasn't a guarantee that you would get this sort of mainstream ticket to fame. And Carlin never really had that. He always remained, I guess, true to who he was on the fringes. But part of that was because he couldn't take acting jobs because he had to be on the road making money for stand-up. So in a way, his debt, well, I'm sure it hurt his life, but it did help him become the legendary stand-up that was cranking out 2 specials. A special every year or 2, which he did start doing. By the way, while we're talking about kind of addiction and things like that too, he battled cocaine. If you're interested in that aspect of his life, his daughter Kelly Carlin has done a bunch of interviews and wrote a book about it and things like that. She talked about her relationship with her father and her mother, who was also an addict. Her addiction was even worse with alcohol. So Kelly Carlin has talked a lot about that in a bunch of interviews, but Carlin did battle it a lot and then ended up kind of getting away from it. Like, I think smoked weed more or less up until the end, but he was able to kick cocaine and acid and all of that stuff. But because he had to, tour and do stand-up, he started doing this writing. But it became like, where do I just keep releasing records? People kind of think record sales started to slow down for him. His first 3 albums went gold, but then things kind of just slowed down. Like you even heard him say he wasn't on the Tonight Show anymore. People thought he was losing his mind. So his career takes this dip in the late 70s into the 80s. But then new advancements in technology did help him out.
Next, we have talking about sitcom on O&A.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So before we get there, we'll talk about his sitcom, which, like I said, he never had massive success in film or television. I would think a sitcom with George Carlin would work. And my immediate thought was, it would like, what about All in the Family, him playing an Archie Bunker type of character just for, society's problems 10, 15 years later. But I wonder if maybe the plot of this was a little too derivative of All in the Family, because he did play literally a cab driver. So I don't know if people saw it as like too close to Archie Bunker. I've never seen the George Carlin show. It sounded, from what I read of it, kind of like All in the Family meets Cheers. Well, again, now that I'm saying that, Archie Bunker's place was him at a bar. So maybe it was a little too a derivative of All in the Family now that I'm realizing it. But let's hear him talk about the sitcom and why it didn't necessarily work.
But some guys pull it off very well.
George Carlin show lasted, I think, 1 season. Was that? I'm sure it had some. Was the writing difficult because of what they were telling you above? Was it hard to go where you wanted to go?
I knew it probably wouldn't have much of a chance, but I think I was 55 then, and I said to myself, I've had a lot of offers from different directions about sitcoms over the years, and maybe I ought to at least give this one shot so I don't say someday, gee, I should have tried that. I mean, I hadn't really turned into as good a writer as that was 15 years ago. And I'm a better, I didn't know I was a good writer then. I mean, I've had 3 books since that thing failed. I'm so glad that show went away. When that guy called me from Fox, I said, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this, because I was afraid this would drag on for another year and then come to an end, I had a showrunner, creative partner, Sam Simon, who was a brilliant comic talent, but famously disliked by his colleagues in the business, and he admits that. And it was very difficult for me, and I think the cards were stacked against me. I wasn't part of the club. You got to be part of that club. That's a Hollywood club, and you have to work your way into it in certain ways. And coming in from the outside like that, it didn't work. And they didn't back my show. Fox didn't really back it. So
I guess it would be tough to have George Carlin, like the appeal of George Carlin on network television. But let's not forget, Fox at that time, if you were going to be on network TV, Fox would be like the edgy place. We talked about that with like Married with Children and Martin and the stuff they were doing, The Simpsons, stuff they were doing that was different and edgier than some of the other stuff on network TV. So you would think that would be the good place for it. Sam Simon, he is correct, is notoriously has the difficult label put on him, that he's like difficult to work with or get along with. But George Carlin had that as well. George Carlin was labeled difficult, and George Carlin, it reminded me a lot of what Mike Myers said when we covered him a couple months ago, where Mike Myers was like, people say I'm difficult to work with. I demand perfection. Like that's why I'm creating good things, because I demand that out of people. And that was kind of Carlin's reasoning too, which, the further we examined Mike Myers' case, it felt like a bit of a cop-out because he was complaining about bagels or whatever the fuck he was mad about. So it didn't always hold true. But I do think there is something when you're talking about people of this level, literally, we're having the discussion, is George Carlin the greatest stand-up of all time? If not, he's certainly in the discussion. When you're talking about people of this caliber, I do understand why at times they're difficult to work with, because they're demanding that you meet their output. Like what they have this mind that might be creating something that's never been done before. So you're going to need to step up your game as opposed to whatever sitcom you might be working on. But I will also say, while I'm praising George Carlin for being a genius, the plot, like I said, I never saw the show. I did not see the George Carlin show. So you guys correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Felt a little derivative of All in the Family, just based on the general plot and putting George Carlin in that sort of Archie Bunker role, you know.
Next, we do have Evolution.
Okay, yeah. So this is what I was talking about before, where his career, at least in his mind, stalls out in the late 70s, early 80s, and he's looking for something to kick that back into gear.
In 19 and then through the 70s, I developed that, and then I kind of lost track of what would be next, and I didn't know. I kind of drifted, and I was grasping. Then in 92, even though I did these HBO shows, and they were plenty good, I like them. I still would stand behind every word of them, but there wasn't a new voice yet. There was just like an improved voice that was ongoing. In 1992, I discovered silence on the stage. I discovered that you could have long periods of silence. The show I did, Jammin' in New York, had a long, more or less serious piece called "The Planet is Fine, the People are Fucked," and and it was about the fact that the planet will outlive us. Don't worry about the planet. People who tell you they're worried about the planet are not. They're worried about themselves and their habitat. They want a clean place to live, and that's fine. But don't be talking about how you're going to save the planet. You're not. The planet will outlive you, and it will heal itself. And that piece was very thoughtful and very interesting, and I loved it. But I had to learn that there were times in the show when it was okay not to get laughs. Because one of the jobs I have, besides getting laughs, is to engage the imagination. Just in general, to engage the person's imagination. If I make them laugh along the way, that's part of the deal for me. But I learned then that I had a kind of a more serious writer voice in me. And that's when another shift took place. And the shows that follow, that came in the 90s, are representative of that. There's more of a social commentator in them. There's more of a, if you will, a quote unquote philosophy beginning to emerge. And that was another important shift for me that is still playing out.
Plus, it was the first live one.
It was. I was interested to hear him talk about that, where that's kind of what everyone says about George Carlin, is that he got very serious. And some of that at the end, like, is it even comedy, or is he just giving sermons? Is he giving TED Talks? I'd never heard him address that. That was kind of purposeful, that it was like, there's no harm in me being serious and making these points as long as I'm being interesting or saying something. So I didn't realize it was as deliberate as it was. I thought it was just like he kind of became this grumpier old man, and so there just happened to be less jokes in it. But there were a couple things there I want to address before we get into maybe that bigger discussion. But through the 80s, the advancement that I referred to that really helped him was HBO. The idea that HBO exists. George Carlin is doing these, bits like 7 Dirty Words, and he starts to push the envelope more, and then his mind gets into bigger things like politics and society and the world. And he says, I can't do this on NBC. And luckily, HBO becomes not just a place where you can do that, it becomes the premier place for stand-up comedy. And they will also allow you to, there's not this stringent programming the way there were on networks, where every year or two, George Carlin wants to drop a special. HBO's like, yeah, fuck it. We'll find a free Friday night. We can drop it and then play it however often. So the development of HBO really came at the perfect time for George Carlin, because people were seeking out this, this new type of content that they weren't able to find ever before anywhere else, really. And the reason I left the last little bit of that clip in is because I don't know if maybe I heard it when they were promoting some of these other specials, but I remember like Chris Rock does his live Netflix special, and they're like, oh my, it's live. Can you believe it? And I remember kind of being like, didn't Brian Regan do this like 8 years ago?
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe Regan, I didn't realize Carlin did one. So that Jim in New York in 92 was live. And he points out in this interview, he's like, well, I did one like 8 years earlier than that was live on HBO. It's like live from Union Hall or something like that. So he did a couple live specials even before. And then you also have Seinfeld did it live. Technically, it came out. It was live when it aired and then came out like re-released. But like there have been other live specials, and Carlin actually was the first one. So he does not get enough credit for that.
I do find it strange, though. I guess that explains why he put out so many specials, is he wasn't focusing on laughs.
Yeah, well, no, because in the 80s he was still, at least he says he was still focusing on I think it became this thing that became true of now it's the norm for comedians. It's kind of what they have to do. Where like George just got sick of the material and he's like, let me record it so that I can move on and write about more things and I can keep touring. And again, part of that is probably fueled by the debt that he was in and the money he owed the IRS, where he's like, I got to go back to all these towns. I need to write new material. So there might be some of that fueling it. But I do think like he was never topical. And it was interesting to hear him talk in these interviews about topicality, where he says, I think being topical is boring because you're talking about these fleeting moments rather than things that people can always relate to. And if I were going to push back on that, I would say sometimes these topical things can be used to make a broader argument. But I do get what he's saying, where if you talk about whatever the news of the day, whenever you're watching this, whatever the headlines are, people aren't going to be thinking about them in 6 months. So it's hard to write a stand-up act around that. Whereas Carlin is saying, I'll talk about these things broadly, not necessarily mention them by name, but I will talk about them in the grand scheme of things, and then they'll hold up forever. And we've seen that come true where both sides have adopted Carlin, where when there's a story in the news, people will tweet out, George Carlin said it perfectly 40 years ago. And it's like, he wasn't talking about either of your teams, I don't think. But
no, he's not. I know you set it up to make me sound like a fucking hipster, but at the beginning when you said, it's like the cool thing not to be his biggest fan.
Yeah.
I just never really connected with him.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that's actually the next conversation I wanted to have. What he said there in that clip reminds me almost eerily to what Dave Chappelle is doing now.
Yeah.
Like almost, it seems almost purposeful that Chappelle was like, I'm going to do what Carlin did, because Carlin and Chappelle both fall into this category. And Carlin, I've always written it off as, I was too young when he was popular, so I just don't connect with it. Maybe that's why I'm not laughing, but that's not right, because there's a bunch of Carlin stuff I do laugh at. I think there's plenty of times where he's funny. I think the 7 Dirty Words bit is funny. And Chappelle is one of my favorite comedians of all time. His last few specials, it feels like an insult if you're like, oh, Chappelle's latest special didn't make me laugh. I don't know that he's going for laughs. Like, genuinely, I don't know if he's attempting jokes. Like, I'm not saying he's not making jokes and bombing. He's just talking. He's putting on a sermon, which, whether you agree or disagree with Chappelle, I find him to be an incredibly interesting speaker.
Yes.
And I find Carlin to be an incredibly interesting speaker. To me, that is a different discussion than, is this person the best comedian of all time? That's why you start to go with Pryor, Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, Louis, Norm. You go with some of these other names, because if you're saying who's the best comedian, you're asking who's the funniest guy on stage, right? You would think, which by their own purposeful admission is not Carlin or Chappelle. At least not Chappelle anymore. It was at one time, but
well, he thinks he is. He wears
yes, very subtle, the goat.
Yeah.
Puts a C on his chest.
I would find that disgusting. I'd be like Tom Brady or Michael Jordan doing that. It's
upsetting.
Yeah.
It's upsetting. Let us call you the GOAT, Dave. But
that's up to us.
Yeah, which we were calling you that until you started doing that. But yeah, so it's not. I don't think it's a dig at Carlin or Chappelle to say a lot of their specials later in life aren't funny, because you hear Carlin there, and I don't think Chappelle would have the same perspective, if I'm being honest. But Carlin at least had the perspective to say, well, I was going for silence. I wasn't even going for laughs in a lot of these. which is good. It tells you he knew exactly what he was doing. I think he's a very smart guy. I think he's a very enlightened guy and was able to see things well ahead of his time, a lot better than a lot of his peers were. Is he the funniest guy? I don't know. I don't think so. You know, like that's what makes the argument kind of weird.
I just I don't like the serious political stuff, and shocking. When I'm trying to, I would rather listen to someone tell like poop and fart jokes and fucking.
What's weird about Carlin is he did a lot of that.
I know.
When you say fart, almost exclusively fart jokes.
I know.
A lot of the time, which I do think speaks to him being able to pull off that sort of dichotomy. I think that is impressive that he was able to do that. I think, unfortunately, now we limit people where you do one or the other. You do. I said this already, but like, you do silly shit or you do serious shit. It's hard for people to pull off both. And to be fair to critics, it's hard to pull off both well. You know what I mean? I do think you should be critical of people who do it poorly. I think it's a difficult needle to thread pulling off both.
Now we have the norm segment.
Oh, we're at the end already.
I mean, this is a longer. Why are you laughing?
I know. As far as Carlin's career, I feel like we didn't really, but he did. Like, he tried to get more into acting at the end. He played a gay man in a Nick Nolte, Barbra Streisand movie, which at that time is like an edgy thing to do. Like that was interesting that Carlin did that at that time. But again, speaks to how he saw the world and kind of his philosophy on everything. He was well ahead of his time in a lot of stuff that he did. But it's weird, like a guy who had as much respect as Carlin did. Like, we played that clip from Opie and Anthony, and Opie says to him, he's like, there's not a lot of guys that walk in here that we're like awestruck by, but you're one of them. So he had this respect in comedy circles. You would think that would inherently be like, well, let's put him in something. Let's fucking cram him into whatever. But it was like few and far between the big acting roles that he was able to get, even though he was definitely interested in trying some of them.
Even like the Rushmore discussion, I would probably put him on it. I understand how everyone looks at him. I think something's wrong with me, and there's a disconnect with me with him.
I don't think so. I think it's pretty normal, especially our generation, to not be like, oh my God, Carlin's the funniest. I think Mount Rushmore, it depends on what you're asking. Who are the most influential people in comedy history? It's probably Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, George Carlin, and Red Fox. But is anyone like, those are the 4 funniest guys ever? Probably not. The only one that I think holds up, like both pioneer and hilarious, would be like Joan Rivers.
Yeah.
And Pryor, if you consider him that, you know what I mean?
Definitely.
Like Pryor for sure. Like, you can watch Pryor stuff that holds up and is hilarious now. But and then I guess then you have to ask yourself, like, are Rickles and Rodney pioneers because they were kind of doing something that paved the way for other comedians? That's where it becomes a more interesting debate. Mount Rushmore would be a good episode of this podcast. I think we'd have to get more people on to debate, though. Really challenge me,
Well, there's like you'd have to do your personal one, which no one can argue with, and then the big debate would be the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, Jay Leno and Judd Apatow were on a show where it's called Mount Rushmore on X.
Yeah,
or something.
you were trying to find. It was one of the episodes I wasn't on, I believe, and you were talking about that show because Jay Leno just uncharacteristically went off on someone.
Oh yeah, he called Jackie Mason an asshole.
I was trying to find it because I think you might have been doing a show with Carl. I don't remember, but I was going to send it to whoever was running it. But I couldn't.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion. So maybe we'll do that in the future. We'll see. But the other thing, Carlin at the end did become more of a curmudgeon, and I think dealt with some alcohol issues and things. He got banned from, I think it was the MGM in Las Vegas, where he just went off in the crowd one night and started ranting and raving about how, like, what the fuck is wrong with you people for coming to Las Vegas? And which, by the way, I read some of the quotes. Like, I don't think the audio exists. I read some of the quotes. It was kind of funny. I didn't get the backlash, but I think he went into like alcohol treatment after that. Also, famously, he recorded a special on September 9th and 10th, 2001, that was going to be called "I Kind of Like It When a Lot of People Die." And then I don't know if you know what happened the next day. But
Yes.
But that got scrapped.
Didn't come out until 2016.
Yeah. So and then he put out these specials that were, like I said, they were these talks, but they kind of became what he was known for. And I definitely don't think they're the funniest things in comedy history, but I do think all of them are very interesting. And I think that ultimately, kind of like Craig just said, if you're going to have the discussion, who's the greatest comedian of all time, it's very difficult to not have George Carlin on that list. But I do think in, I don't know, 30 years, whatever the number is, in a certain amount of years, George Carlin will be viewed similarly to Lenny Bruce, where it's like, I get what the impact he had. I don't think he's the funniest. I do think the difference with Carlin is a lot of Carlin's perspective. Maybe we're too close to it time-wise. A lot of his stuff feels timeless in a way Lenny Bruce absolutely does not. If you go back and listen to Lenny Bruce stuff, it feels completely dated. Just the way he's talking, the dialect he uses, everything feels very dated. Carlin does not feel dated. So I think that does help his case ultimately. But no, if you were talking the funniest of all time, I don't think Carlin is in there. Oddly enough, a guy who definitely doesn't think that is Norm Macdonald. I couldn't find the clips of Norm saying it. I only found this one, oddly. But Norm would always say, like, George Carlin's not the funniest comedian ever. Like, he would say it with kind of this, like, matter of fact, I don't think George Carlin was that funny. He's like, he's a genius, but I don't think he's that funny.
Well, you tune into some of his specials, and it would sound like a symposium on
right
greenhouse gas.
But you got to give George Carlin this. When asked who his favorite comedians were, this guy was on his list. And I apologize for where the clip is cut. I couldn't find a cleaner version, but you get a little taste of Norm here.
And then Norm Macdonald, for instance, forget the sitcom.
Look, Taylor, I don't think you understand. You're a huge whore.
Forget the news on Saturday Night Live.
Thanks, I'm Norm Macdonald, and now the fake news. Well, it is finally official. Murder is legal in the state of California.
But his stand-up, well, again, what kind of a strange left field thing, and that appeals to me. Those are the ones I think of when I answer the question.
I just love that he named, whenever this was, prior to 2008, when Norm didn't have a stand-up special out there. I love that he said, forget Saturday Night Live and his show, whatever. Like, based on his stand-up, Norm is one of the best. I love that he said that.
It's crazy.
But he was also, another thing we didn't really touch on is how good he was to young comedians. Two guys he named, and then he said the other two guys he named that he liked for younger comedians at that time, Mitch Hedberg and Lewis Black, which actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I feel like if you combined Mitch Hedberg and Lewis Black, you get early Carlin.
You get Carlin.
Yeah.
You get the potential for any stage Carlin. If you
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense that those were his other two choices. But there's a bunch of stories of him being very good to young comedians. My favorite is that Joe DeRosa called a radio show he was on. And he said, Joe, do you have any advice for a young comedian? And George said, keep kicking him in the nuts, kid. And Joe DeRosa got that tattooed onto him. And later in life found out that George said that to literally every young comedian that he met. Well, we've done episodes in the past where we've included stories about Carlin helping young guys. I think Gary Shandling was a big one, if I remember correctly. That literally he saw Gary Shandling as a young comedian and like motivated him to not quit. So he was very good to young guys, and I liked that he shouted them out in that way. Not that Norm was young necessarily at that time, but maybe lesser known, I guess. Anyways, that's George Carlin. You guys let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree, disagree, where you rank him on your comedy Mount Rushmore in the discussion of greatest of all time. And also, like, I think it's important to keep in the discussion. People are like, I never found him funny. But I think, as this episode showed, there is a lot more to him than that when you're talking about why he might be one of the greatest. So let me know. Sound off in the comments. Like, subscribe. All that helps more people find this show. I appreciate you guys doing that and supporting the program wherever you get podcasts, on YouTube, video on Spotify now, audio, wherever else you get podcasts as well. All the links are at blindmike.net if you're looking for an easy place to find those. Blind Mike Project is live every Sunday at 10 a.m. on the same YouTube channel. And you can also find that wherever you get podcasts. And you can subscribe. If you subscribe, you also get the new hit show Sweep of the Nation, BTH, for Patreon and YouTube members every Monday night. So check me out with my friends Cardiff and Tukey. If you want a little more relaxed, laid back show.
And obviously, BTH stands for what?
Don't worry about it. This is not a shit. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal.
Well, it is a big deal. That's the whole point.
It's a very big deal. Yeah, but check that if you're a member or just support the show for free. We appreciate you guys doing that. Very Good Show is back in a big way. I'm excited. Very Good Chow is also taking the world by storm.
Yeah,
so
I'm really good at coming up with names.
Very Good Chow. I like it. I'm excited for it. So go subscribe to Craig's YouTube channel as well. Verygoodshow.org is where you can get all things Craig.
Yeah, find the YouTube. I hope the YouTube link, the one thing where things are, I hope it's on that website.
It's at Very Good Show on YouTube, I'm pretty sure.
That's correct.
I can't believe you have that.
Right? I was stunned. Like, that's why I was like, it was the first name that I thought of when Matt and I started the show. And I was like, imagine. And I looked and it was not taken.
We don't need a whole retrospective, but all right, go to verygoodshow.org.
I found the muse.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time on Why Are You Laughing?
Zip it up and zip it out.